what's up? My name's Samuel Leeds. I'm a property investor, and this video is all going to be about planning permission, how to get planning permission, permitted development, buying on Greenbelt, trying to find Brownfield sites, all the ins and outs and the detail of planning. Now, I've brought in a planning expert for this interview, so I think you're going to really enjoy this. If you enjoy the channel, hit like, subscribe, and Chris, thanks so much for coming down.
Pleasure.
So you are a planning expert, and you've actually helped us recently on one of our sites. Why don't you just give a little introduction as to what a planning consultant does?
Okay, well, a planning consultant essentially tries to get planning permission. So we run a planning consultancy that reviews sites, tries to understand the risks associated with trying to get planning permission, trying to understand what you can get planning permission for, how you can maximise it. In certain circumstances, we are brought in to troubleshoot and try and overcome a planning argument. But our job essentially is to guide developers on getting planning permission, which is the all-important aspect of any property development process, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I mean, as a property developer, we all know that the profit's in the planning most of the time, and that's where you get most of your profit from. So why don't you give us an idea then, like if you're looking for sites, so if I'm out looking at pieces of land, I'm on Google Earth or Nimbus Maps, looking at all the different sites, what's the best way to kind of know whether you're going to get planning or not? I know it's a big question.
Huge question.
Yeah, I know it is, or should we say, how would you even go about finding these? Or if you're a self-builder, what's the best way to go about finding these kind of little beautiful plots?
Okay, a lot of it is common sense. Okay, so the first port of call is understanding the designations of the area you want to live in. Okay, so I'm assuming in this circumstance that any land hunter understands the general areas they want to build in. They come to that conclusion themselves for whatever reason. And then it's all about understanding the designations of that area. So for example, a region will have multiple different planning designations. You'll have land that sits within sort of these arbitrary imaginary red lines that are classed as the settlement boundaries. They're the main built-up areas for towns, cities and villages. And then you've got the areas that sit outside of it. I know it's often that land that's more attractive to people because ultimately either the land's cheaper, it's Greenfield, it gives you the opportunity to do a little bit more than you would be able to if it was the land inside of the boundary. But that land is caveated by a huge swathe of different designations. So whether that be Greenbelt, whether that be open countryside, whether that be a conservation area, national park, etc. So it's all about understanding the ramifications of trying to proceed with any of those sites. Yeah. As a rule of thumb, the closer the site is to a settlement boundary, the more sustainable it's likely to be. If it's open countryside rather than Greenbelt, it's policed to a slightly lower level. So it's more likely in principle to get planning permission if you were to try and balance things out. Yeah. And then it's all about the common sense stuff, the physical layouts of the land. So you want to look at parts of land that are relatively unisolated, so surrounded by or within reasonable distance of other properties, has a distinct access, has access through to services and facilities, etc. So when you're looking at Google Earth, that's what you're looking for. Yeah. Then in terms of sort of other scenarios that you can take advantage of, it's just all about doing due diligence. So if land becomes available or you become aware of land, it's doing the due diligence against it. It's checking the planning policies, which you may require a planning consultant to help you with. Yeah. It's understanding if there's any environmental designations, etc., that offer a red flag against it. So unfortunately, there's no one answer, and unfortunately, it's hugely caveated by region to region differences. But the one thing I'd take away is the fact that every land has got a clear designated policy position. Yeah. Right? So understand what that is, and then really work on the basis of, if I were to build a house here or a couple of houses here, how would that sit in the land? Could I get away with it? Yeah. Could I offer the benefits that could push it over the line? Yeah. And I think if you understand that, that'll get you the vast majority of the way there. And the rest is, the stuff that you're more well versed in than me, Samuel, I'd say.
Well, I mean, I'm going to get on a little bit later on to sort of things like understanding the local plan, Greenbelt, identifying brownfield sites. But I think that I usually say to people when they're just starting out is, first thing is to just use your common sense. Like if there's a piece of land, can you imagine there being houses built on there? Is there access? How are people gonna, are there other houses around? If it's just in the middle of nowhere, then it probably won't. And I know that's a very, very, very simplistic approach, but
it's the correct one. The vast majority of the time, if it's sort of a sliding scale of impact, right? So You can have a parcel of land that sits in the Greenbelt, but if it sits 100 metres from the development boundary associated with a settlement, you could, in all reasonable aspects, walk out of the land, go and use its services and facilities. Then that's obviously going to have a substantially lower impact than if the land is 3 miles away from the nearest settlement, high on a hill, and you build a house and it sticks out like a sore thumb. So it is there for interpretation, and it is there to, to present itself as a position where if you apply common sense, it'll get you a long way along the way.
And also, we're in an interesting time right now with the internet, because everything is online. Now, I know it might be difficult to get the answers online. It can be like finding a needle in a haystack. But when you talk about the boundary, where the boundary is, again, that's on the internet. You can search for this stuff. So you can find it. So with a lot of due diligence, and if you're a serious property developer and you want to find sites in one particular area, you've got to spend a few weeks just really understanding the rules.
Certainly, yeah. And a lot of it is available for you to see, right? A lot of the information is simply going on the local planning authority's website or the local council's website into the planning section. They'll have a planning policy section. There'll be a series of maps that will show you the classifications of different policies of land. Search through it, read the policy in question. You'll start to build up a picture of what you can and can't do in certain areas. And then just go and look at other planning applications in the area and see how they've managed to get something across the line. And again, you can start building up a picture of, is it viable? Is it possible even for us to get planning permission here? And if it is, this is the way we've got to go about it.
And then I guess it goes down to having a team as well. Like you shouldn't ever try and do everything on your own. You should always have experts, consultants around to be able to kind of do more further due diligence on your behalf. I believe that anyway. I think you'd be mad to try and put forward planning applications without having a planning consultant, for example.
Obviously, I'm biased, right? But I think so. The planning is so front-loaded these days in terms of the costs. You've got a ridiculous amount of surveys that are not cheap. You've got a planning application fee which is not cheap, architectural plans which are not cheap. So there's a lot of money on the line with every application you make. And ultimately, a lot of the time, all you're doing is trying to balance cost risk, and you're trying to understand, okay, in my particular circumstances, what is the cost that I can take on board and I'm prepared to risk against this site? But the all-important question, therefore, is what's the risk? What are the chances of getting planning permission? And ultimately, that question can only be answered by few people, really, because you want to take advantage of experience to provide that information. And usually that's either a planning consultant if the case is particularly tricky, and in some circumstances, an architect who maybe has experience of delivering within that area as well. So, it's important to get that extra information.
One of the things a lot of my subscribers and students are absolutely crazy obsessed with at the moment is permitted development, because I know there's been some recent changes just last year in what you can do, and there's a lot more things that you can do with permitted development rights. So would it be all right if you maybe just share what permitted development rights is and maybe explain some of the things that you can do, because people would assume you have to get planning, and it's crazy how much you can do right now without getting planning permission. So maybe give us a deep dive into that.
I will, as far as I can. Okay, so permitted development, or PD, as we generally call it, as most people call it who deal with it. So it is the ability to do things without planning permission, ultimately. It's governed by a slightly separate piece of legislation to what a planning application is. But a lot of the time you still have to meet a certain provision of conditions. And the difference between PD and a planning application is that if you meet those conditions, you are automatically allowed to get on with that work. But the other difference is, if you don't meet any of those conditions, you can't overcome it with other arguments or sort of reshape the narrative in the same way you can a planning application. So it's a lot more black and white, and it's a lot more yes and no, which has its benefits and drawbacks. In terms of what you can do, in terms of householder work or householder improvements or home improvements, you've got the ability to make changes by way of extensions, whether they be single-story rear extensions, single-story side extensions. In some circumstances, double-story rear extensions. Now, the amount of depth that you can do in those circumstances is predicated by the approach. So in some circumstances, you can go 3 meters back to your terrace or semi-detached property without the need for planning permission, 4 meters for a detached property. There is another mechanism, again, try not to make it too complicated, but where you can go back 6 meters for a terrace or a semi-detached property and up to 8 meters for a detached property. But then you have to tell the council you're intending to do it and give them notice to be able to determine whether you can or not.
That's a huge extension though there.
Huge.
And you know, building back, I mean, you're adding a lot of value to the house. And this is the thing, you know, when you see, this is what I look out for. If I'm in a street and I can see that there's some houses that have already done it, and there might be selling. I was in London recently, and there was properties. The houses were selling for like 1.6, 1.7 million, and they'd all been built back. They'd been brought back. They're detached houses. They'd been brought back 4 meters, and on some instances double.
Yeah.
Dormers at the top, and they were selling for 1.6 million. And then I was looking at this house that was on for 1 million, open to offers, and I'm thinking, well, I know I'm going to get permitted development rights to do it. It's been done in the street. It's only probably going to cost a couple $100,000, but it's going to significantly increase the value of the house. Yeah. Normally, there'd be a little bit of a, will I get planning now? But when you know there's permitted development in the area, it's almost like a big win for property investors.
It's a huge comfort because planning takes time and it's risky. So it takes that off the table. The entire point of the current version of PD was bought in off the back of the 2009 crash. The idea was to try and reinvigorate the essentially building operations in the UK. And so they took the decision, okay, well, with the small scale stuff, if we think that we're going to give you planning permission anyway, we may as well just let you get on with it. And that's what that does. And there are other types of PD. You've got, in terms of value added to properties, you've got the Class E, which is outbuildings, which can often be hugely advantageous because in some circumstances, you have the ability to build up to 50% of your rear garden space as an outbuilding. You know, if you're building things like gyms or summer houses, offices, etc., all of those ancillary functions to the house, you can really gain added value without the need for permission there. And then you step outside the house and there are other PD rights. So you have the ability to convert agricultural barns into houses in certain circumstances. And the most recent one was Class MA, which came to play last year. And that is the ability to change existing commercial units into residential units, which is the one that the press are calling the transformation of the high street. Yeah, it's hugely caveated, but there are certainly opportunities there to change tired office space that's not being used into highly valuable inner city residential development.
So tell me then, in what instances, because I know permitted development isn't always permissible if you're in Article 4 or in a conservation area, like this house, for instance, I can't get permitted development.
No, you've not got it here, right?
No, I haven't got it here. I'm trying to get planning permission to do some stuff. But in what instance would you need to get planning permission to convert offices into residential houses or flats?
In what series would you need to get planning permission?
Yeah.
So if it's considered that the conversion could, in principle, have an impact upon what's called the quiet enjoyment or the commercial enjoyment of the surrounding area, which is relatively ambiguous, right?
Yeah.
What it generally means is if the council think that you taking advantage of PD rights to convert an office to a house will have serious ramifications on either the rest of the commercial street or on the occupiers of the property itself, then they'll ask for you to get planning permission instead.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean to say you won't get planning permission. What it means is it allows them to put a closer critical eye on what you're intending to do. It'll put greater responsibility on you to bring forward more detailed architectural plans to show that the inhabitants can occupy the property in a way that works for the high street and to show that it doesn't impact upon the value of the high street itself. So Class MA is quite tricky, right? Because it was brought out and there's a lot of noise around it to say, okay, this is going to transform the high street, but it's hugely caveated, which means that in each and every case, you need to make sure that you've actually got PD rights, and if you haven't, then you need planning permission.
So question then, if you're doing a conversion, let's say a commercial to a residential conversion, and you think you're going to get permitted development rights, what's the actual process of being able to do that?
Okay, so in that circumstance, there is a need for a lawful development certificate anyway, okay? But to take it back, if you're doing any sort of PD that requires a degree of what's called prior approval, essentially that process is you have to notify the authority of the council anyway that you're intended to take advantage of your PD rights.
Yeah.
So it's almost a notice to confirm your intent to use it. But that notice gives the council a period of time to check that you're according with those conditions. So you treat it almost like a planning application, but it's a planning application where you've got 1 foot through the door. So you present to the local authority a series of plans, an intention of what you intend to do, and then you tell them how you're abiding by the particular conditions of that PD right. And then they'll have a period of time to be able to determine themselves whether you accord with that process or not. And if you accord with the conditions, then essentially you're told you have permitted development rights and you can crack on with it. If you don't, then they'll say, these are the reasons why you don't accord with this particular condition. And what it means is, the key thing is, it doesn't mean to say you couldn't get planning permission for it. It just means to say that you do need planning permission for it.
Yeah.
So in most circumstances, there is a process to go through that involves the council, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But at least what that does is it gives you the paperwork to be able to put into the title plan or whatever you're doing, right? So it allows you to be able to turn around and say, if you then sell the property, you've got the paperwork to say everything's been done in the legitimate manner. If you're using PD rights where you don't need to contact the council to start with and you just go ahead and do it, at some point you're going to have to do what's called a lawful development certificate to say that you did that work lawfully at that particular time. And that needs to be done before you sell the property because it needs to be added into the title pack.
Right.
So there is always a step, one way or the other, there's always a step. The benefit of not having to go through that starting process, or the council initially, is that you can crack on. Right? It allows you, to a certain extent, it allows you to get on with things, but in the knowledge that at some point in the future, you're still going to have to regularise it for the benefit of, completing the title of the property.
Yeah. So what's the difference then, Chris, between Greenfield sites and green belt? Because that's something that a lot of people get confused over.
There is a difference, yeah. So basically anything outside of a settlement boundary is Greenfield. Okay, so anything that sits outside of these arbitrary imaginary lines is classed as Greenfield land.
And these lines, the settlement boundaries, how do you find these? How do you get hold of? How do you know where the boundary is?
The easiest way of finding them out is on the local authority's website.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as I've said before, there are over 300 local planning authorities in the UK, right? All with their own systems, all with their own intricacies, quirks, etc.
Yeah.
So there's no one consistent place to look. But the easiest place to go is local authority's website, into the planning section, into the planning policy section, and one way or another, you'll see these settlement boundary plans.
Right.
And so what you're looking at, is if there's a parcel of land you're looking at, you can see, we sit outside of the development boundary.
So it's Greenfield because it's not within the where the houses
Correct.
are. So it's Greenfield, but green belt.
Different.
What's that then?
So when you're in the Greenfield, you're then subject to another classification on top of it. So Greenfield is almost like a description word of in or out. But then on top of that, you've got the individual designations. So I've mentioned open countryside, for example.
Yeah.
Open countryside is land in the Greenfield that isn't otherwise protected. Okay, so it's just classed as open countryside Greenfield land. Green belt has a different function. So green belt is originally meant to be a sort of a band of green, a belt of green, that sits around town, cities and villages to try and protect it from sprawl.
Yeah.
So to try and police it in a greater manner to stop those places from growing. It carries other functions, but its general approach is that if you're looking to build in the green belt, it's substantially harder to get planning permission because there is in policy, there is actually presumption against you doing it, except in certain circumstances. So in order to get planning permission in the green belt, the vast majority of the time, you need to provide what's called very special circumstances, which are a collection or a singular material benefit that is sufficient enough in its weight to outweigh the policy harm.
Right.
So the policy harm is, if you want to build a house in the green belt, it's substantial weight against your case. Okay, so there's a substantial policy position against it. And I always use these imaginary weighing scales, right? So you've got this meaty negative disbenefit against you. And you've got to try and outweigh that with either one singular benefit or multiple different benefits.
Yeah.
And they can be the particular physical characteristics of the site. Maybe it's been developed before in a different manner. Maybe it's got a whole host of buildings on that you can squeeze down into one new building. Maybe it's the lack of housing need in a certain area. Maybe it's ecological benefits that you can show. Maybe it's green principles that you can bring forward. Maybe it's the design itself that's outstanding enough. And it's often a combination of these factors. So each and every greenbelt case is different because statistically it's very hard to get planning permission.
Yeah.
So it's all about really understanding how to knit together a narrative to provide that beneficial weight. So if you're looking at land to build on, statistically it's much harder to build in the greenbelt than in the open countryside. In both circumstances, you still need to push the envelope a little bit in terms of how you're going to get planning permission.
I had a friend recently reach out to me and he was saying, talking about paragraph 55, where if you build something that's outstandingly beautiful, there are exceptions where they sometimes will let you build. I told him that it would probably be unlikely, and the amount of money they'd have to spend on this absolutely incredible house, like it's not really a scalable plan for a developer. What is that rule? I know it came out, was it Margaret Thatcher that brought that in? I think it was.
Well, I mean, it's a version of it's been out for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Okay, so a version of this idea that, okay, if you bring something forward that is particularly exceptional or outstanding, then that can provide a mechanism to support.
It sounds like really a bit of a ace card for really rich people that just want to build their dream home.
So it was. Okay, so it's evolved. It was for years.
Yeah.
It's evolved a little bit. So it's still referred to as paragraph 55. It's not actually paragraph 55 anymore. It's gone forward twice, and it's now paragraph 80E.
Oh, wow.
Which is really catchy, right? But everyone knows it's paragraph 55.
Yeah.
Okay, so the premise is you're able to bring something forward that originally was both innovative and outstanding to a sufficient standard that it justifies its position within a locality. Now, what that meant is, in the past, you'll have seen a lot of green principle, the very energy efficient houses, well above the expected standard, that were so excellent that they were able to justify their development in that location. What that evolved into in 2012 onwards was a requirement to not only be architecturally outstanding, but also be innovative in the way it's been designed specifically for that location. So you needed to be able to present a narrative to say, okay, well, architecturally, this is the reason why this works here. So imagine grand designs on steroids. That's what we're talking about. It's stepped back again now. Okay, so as of 2021, the wording is actually reduced down because the bar was getting so high that it was impossible to reach the definitions. We're actually now back in a position where the development you bring forward no longer has to be innovative. It just has to be designed to an outstanding manner. And to meet the outstanding definition, it's to say, okay, well, the design is absolutely outstanding for the context of this location. Yeah. Which means that technically an architect could design something in one location, tweak it, and say it's still outstanding for this location. It's no longer compared against that location because it's more regionalised now, which does give greater opportunities to do it for people that aren't millionaires, which is helpful. And what we've seen over the course of the past 12 months is statistically, paragraph 80 development is occurring more now. Its success rate was crazy low up until last year.
I think it was 1 in 10.
It was even lower than that. At some points across the time, it was getting down to sort of 2 or 3% success rate.
Oh my goodness.
Because the issue is it's a twofold process, right? So what you do is you get a design that you're happy with, you take it to a design review panel, independent panel of architects, who review it and determine it as outstanding or not. They package up a letter, and then it goes to the local planning authority with their support. Now, a lot of the time, the issue was a lot of the cases were going to them, and they were disregarding them, so they weren't even getting to the application stage, but the costs were there. Yeah. So when you look at it from here, it was like 2%. It was crazy. Now it's substantially increased because the barriers are reduced. So all of a sudden you're in a position where you say, okay, well, we haven't got to do a floating house on some stilts anymore, to make something work. We can do something that is, it's architecturally superior, but it's not ostentatious, it's not ridiculous, it's not a Teletubby house, it's something that's really high quality, and we're able to sell a narrative to make it work. Yeah. So all of a sudden it is more opportunistic than it used to be, but it's still super expensive, right?
And it's not very scalable, is it? I don't know. No. There's no developers that I've ever met that say this is my strategy.
Most people that do it are building their dream houses. Yeah. It's not really a process.
They happen to have some greenbelt land and they want to build their dream house. I think if you're looking at as an actual business, as a property developer, and you're scanning Greenbelt, I would imagine you would probably advise, and agree with me on this, you want to be looking for brownfield sites within Greenbelt. So maybe you could just talk about the definition of brownfield site, because I didn't actually know when I first started looking for brownfield sites that like agricultural barns and stuff sometimes didn't even count. Nope. So I ran into some issues. So I just want to be really clear, what is categorically a brownfield site? How can you identify it?
Okay, so try and give you a clear definition when there's not one. So the issue is that so brownfield in its general term is this idea of, okay, it's been previously developed on. Yeah. But that's actually not true, right? What brownfield is, it's something that's been previously developed on to the same appropriate use for its locality. So let me take a step back and I'll explain what that means. So if you're looking at a site within a city and it's had a commercial office block on, or it's had a residential property on it, for example, and it's been demolished, that's a brownfield site, because what you intend to use it for is a similar type of use to what was on it before. Okay. Whereas an agricultural barn, for example, that's never been used for a residential or commercial purpose.
Yes.
So that is classed as previously developed land. It's had development on it, but it's never had development on it that's concurrent with what you wish to develop it for. And so there's a difference between brownfield and previously developed land. Brownfield gives you a mechanism to say, it's encouraged to reuse brownfield land.
Yeah.
Okay, so it gives you the basis on which to say, okay, well, in policy terms, by taking this previous commercial or industrial unit, knocking it down and building a house on, we're actually reusing and recycling brownfield land. But with an agricultural barn, what you're doing is trying to say, well, we're trying to make use of previously developed land.
Yeah.
It doesn't carry the same window into a developable position. So there are two separate, distinct definitions when it comes to land with buildings on it. And it's really important, to be honest, that you, as far as possible, try and navigate yourself towards brownfield land.
Yeah.
If you're trying to make use of previously developed lands to help your case, you're still going to have to do that planning balance exercise. It's just one of the factors that could sit in favour, but it's not enough on its own, right? So if you're looking at an agricultural barn, it's cool, it's got a building on it, you're proposing a building on it. So visually, it has less of an impact upon the countryside.
But if it used to be commercial then, if it's previously developed land, and that land used to be like maybe a factory or a dog kennel or something like that, and now it's been knocked down.
Vast majority of the time that will be classed as brownfield.
Even if it's on Greenbelt, you're still going to be able to build on it, right?
In principle, yeah. So there is plenty of brownfield sites within the Greenbelt, as there are plenty of existing houses within the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt's predominant function is, as I said, to protect urban sprawl. But if it's already been built upon, it's no longer protected.
And I think as well, it's really important to know as property developers that the council, they want developers to build houses. It's not like the council are there with a big stick trying to fight off developers. They're actually crying out. Some cities are massively short on houses, and it's quite a clever system really, because the developers come find the sites, they get their sill tax or whatever. So I think it's really important to know that when you're dealing with the council, although sometimes they can be a pain, they can be slow, that there's a reason for them. You know, the purpose is to make sure that the country stays attractive. If everyone was just building on Greenbelt everywhere, the country would be a mess, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So there's a reason why planning policies exist. I think we've all got our frustrations, even me in the private sector of planning, got our frustrations with how quick the council respond, the quality of some of the decision making. But ultimately, the policies are there for a reason, right? The policies are there to try and make sure that these areas that are already built on are maximising what they can contribute and doing it in an attractive manner. And that's the fundamentals of it. The vast majority of the development within England and Wales should be located within these existing settlements. If you're having to knock something down to rebuild something which is more attractive or increase its contribution to the area by bringing more housing forward, that's more of a holistic approach, and it is by constantly reusing new greenfield sites and not improving what's already there. Right. So the principles are there. The problem is that there are always exceptions to the rule, and it's the exceptions to the rule that provide the complexity the vast majority of the time. But planning policy is there for a reason.
Understand the planning rules, learn it, but this is my advice, before you just go and buy a site, either number one, get a planning consultant to look at all the different factors, or number two, like I do, as you know, buy it on an option. So worst case, if you can't get planning, you've lost a few £1,000s, but you can then walk away.
Both circumstances, you're mitigating risk, right? You're either taking due diligence in order to understand where the risk lies, or within an option agreement, which I highly recommend a lot of the time for bigger schemes, you're giving yourself a cushion, an insurance policy if things don't work out as the way you want them to. Sensible.
And on the SHLA as well, they'll say these are the sites, opportunities. The council are actively wanting developers to come and build. Talk to me about the importance of understanding the national planning policy framework. What is that, and why should everybody read it? As boring as it is, why should every developer?
Classic. 90 pages of tedium. Yeah. Well, look, ultimately, it is the framework, right? So it's the central narrative that the government provides to inform all local plan policy. So each authority has their own local plan with their own, as I said, their own policies, their own quirks. But the issue you've got to remember is that the up-to-date nature of those local plans varies from place to place. And often local politics plays a part. For example, it's very difficult to actually get these things constantly on the on the front foot. So you could be in a position where a local plan could be 10 years old and the sites that have been allocated for housing have already been done.
Yeah.
There's nothing there. So the MPBF is there to provide the shortfall where there is a lack of up-to-date policies in local terms. But it also provides the general aspirations, right? So it tells us, politically, it tells us where we are in terms of where we sit in the country. And at the minute, the framework is a series of paragraphs that essentially everyone has to take on board when making a planning application. What it's currently telling us is that there's a huge shortfall in housing. And a lot of the paragraphs are there to try and define the appropriate approach to try and cover that shortfall. There's not much detail in the MPBF, really. That's why it's a relatively easy read. But if I was to tell any of your viewers where to start in terms of understanding planning, it's probably the best place to start, because it'll give you a flavour of what is expected to be delivered when you're doing any development. So that's what it is. It's general guidance which supplements local plans.
In terms of the national planning policy framework, what's the difference between that and the adopted local strategic plan, and why is it important to read both?
So local plan are the local policies that are...
So if you've got an area, let's say your area is Sandwell Council, that there's going to be a local plan for Sandwell Council, and then there's the national plan. But if you're looking to develop in Sandwell, you need to be really aware of the local strategic plan as well.
Yeah, you need to be aware of both, right?
Yeah.
So the local plan, Sandwell local plan, which I'm quite aware of myself. Yeah. So that is a series of site-specific and area-specific designations. Okay, so it carries an understanding of what the council expects to see with regard to design, typology, housing mix, scale. It tells you what the conservation areas are for a particular area, if there's an area of particular parking stress. It does all the local stuff, right? Yeah. But then it has to be combined with the national policy, which is, as I said, is the broad brush advice for that particular point of time. So for example, Sandwell for years had a very decent 5-year housing supply position, which is a minimum requirement. But the national guidance has told the councils that they need to keep on the constant front foot with that and make sure they keep delivering. Now, if you read the Sandwell local plan on its own, you suggest, okay, well, they're pretty sorted in terms of their housing supply, right? It's going to be very difficult for us to bring something forward that may be trying to satisfy a need as a planning argument. But if you read it in conjunction with the MPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, you'll see actually that a lot of those policies are currently out of date. So it's the reason why you need to refer to both.
How out of date is Sandwell?
Not hugely out of date. So there are local plans which are from 1993 knocking around in the UK. Yeah. So their local plan, I think, don't quote me on this, I think it's 2015. So it's not
there's a lot of local plans that are older than the National Framework Plan.
Most.
Talk to me about the tilted balance.
Okay, so in a circumstance where you don't have a 5-year housing supply, so let's say local authorities, and their job is to keep the government up to date on what their housing supply is. The magic number is 5 years. Okay, so if you have a 5-year housing supply, you are safe from further scrutiny for that point in time until you recalculate it next year. Yeah. And the way that they calculate it is by all the sites they gave permission to and anything that they've allocated for larger scale development that they think is going to be developed at some point. So that's the approach. If at any point your development falls underneath that magic 5-year housing supply line, then what's called tilted balance supplies. Okay, so that is it sounds more dramatic than it is, right? So the idea is that your plan falls silent and it's a free-for-all for developers. In reality, that doesn't happen. Yeah. What it means is that the amount of weight that a local planning authority can give to those housing supply-specific policies falls away. So if, for example, they're saying that, okay, site A, we don't want you to develop housing there because in our view, that should be delivered for a commercial scheme, an office block or whatever it is. It gives a developer the option to say, well, hold your horses. The priority of the MPPF is to deliver housing. You don't have the magic 5-year housing supply. That policy currently falls silent. So it gives you, again, a leg in the door to get something through. What it doesn't do, and this is what's often lost actually in the advice that's currently out there in the ether, it doesn't give you the broad range to go, okay, I'm going to crack on and develop anywhere. Because other policies still apply. So the environmental policies still apply, for example. Right.
But it helps, though, if you're wanting to do a scheme.
Super helpful.
And what about when they update their adopted local strategic plan, does it suddenly get really tough in that area, or is it okay?
Yeah,
it does.
So usually for a good 2 years, what that does is it means that the council have satisfied their housing supply, because what it does is when their local plan is adopted, it's automatically assumed that their 5-year supply has now been brought back up to date.
Right.
So it means for a period of at least 2 years, they're not under the pressure to examine the delivery strategy. So it's a starting point of, we have a 5-year housing supply because we have a new local plan, there's nothing you can do about it. At year 3 of that plan, they'll need to start examining as to how many of those sites they've allocated have actually
And then
been
that's
developed.
when you want to come in again.
And that's when you want to go in again.
Right.
So I wouldn't be hugely worried about trying to make sure that a 5-year housing supply is dipped below that magic line before you take a site forward, because there's often other planning cases that can be presented. But if you're bringing forward a site that you know is quite speculative and you need that golden ticket, then it's all about timing.
So if you put a forward planning application and you are declined and you fail, which is a really frustrating, painful thing to happen, talk to me about the appeal process, because of course you've got the right to appeal, which is part of the planning application, so it's free to appeal. What's the difference between, who do you then go to, and what's the process of that? And
okay, so it's all slightly different. Another admin, another piece of red tape.
And I know this is stuff that we've spoken about off the cameras, because this just happens to us, where we've had, and you've been really helpful in terms of your advice.
Try to be, because it's all about managing risk, right? Spreading risk as far as possible. So that an appeal's made not to the local planning authority, right? So you've had that refusal from the local planning authority, you're annoyed with them. Your appeal goes to the planning inspectorate. The planning inspectorate are a separate government body. They are completely independent from local authorities. They're not regionalised, they're not politicised, they have no engagement with the local authority. They are essentially a pool of independent, highly trained and highly experienced planning consultants who work as inspectors. They all work in principle out of an office in Bristol, but essentially are spread throughout the country. You make an appeal based upon the reasons for refusal, nothing else. So you present what's called a statement of case, which is essentially your planning argument against those reasons for refusal. Everything else is considered in common ground, otherwise it would have been a matter for refusal. You then submit to the planning inspectorate system, separate system. Depending on the circumstances, either you'll put all of the caseload forward that went in your original planning application with that covering statement of case, architectural plans, surveys, etc. Or if it's a householder appeal, the council will do that for you. It goes to the planning inspectorate. The planning inspectorate sets a programme, and the programme is essentially the time frame it takes for the inspector to review the case and issue a decision themselves. The council will have a right to respond to your statement of case throughout that programme, but then you'll get the final say, so you'll get what's called final comments against the council's response to your response. And then there'll be another date where the inspector comes out to see the site. After that date, the inspector will issue a decision. The decision will either be good news, you've got planning permission, we disagree with the council, or it will be sorry, we disagree with you, and we dismiss the appeal. The important aspect is if they grant you planning permission, which the inspectors can do, happy days. If they don't, what you tend to get is a more prescriptive understanding of the reasons why you didn't get the planning permission in the first place. And inspectors often give you sufficient information to say, okay, well, if we do this, this and this, and take you back to the council,
that's
we'll
helpful. Because the council wouldn't do that, would they? The council, when they refuse your planning permission application, they don't say, but if you do this instead, it's not their job to come up with schemes for you.
They'll tend to tell you where you've gone wrong, but they won't tell you how you can fix it. The inspectors a lot of the time will give you that level of prescription. And the important thing is that then it's not a scenario that the inspector's decision is pitted against the council's opinion. The council have to take on the inspector's opinion as the opinion. Okay? So if there are things you can take from that appeal to repackage and in a resubmission, the council have to accept them as the starting point. So that even in appeals failing, there are often benefits that you wouldn't get from the refusal of an application.
It's worth appealing if you've got a decent scheme.
I think so. The downside is time, right? So the time frames are 12 to 16 weeks, and there's no real correlation of speeding that up. So the downside is time, but the upside is that it does mitigate risk further.
Why does everything take so long in planning? Because it's quite straightforward, it should be. Why does the average appeal take 6 months?
Well, most of the time it's staffing. So I'm not going to criticise the public sector and how inefficient they are, because in certain circumstances it's not their fault. the planning system struggles because there is a lack of funding. There has been for a while, a lack of budgets. So the planners that do exist in our environment simply get paid more in the private sector than do in the public sector. So it's difficult to attract staff, particularly experienced staff. But then on top of that, you have an issue of a lack of trained planning consultants.
Yeah.
And essentially a planning officer is a planning consultant. So if you've got a lack of them coming through the system, there's just a lack of...
Because it can take years, can't it, to get planning?
So we've had cases, not to do our practice a disservice at all, but we've had major cases that have taken over 2 years to get planning permission. And it's not as if there's been huge lulls in time. It's constant discussion, negotiation to get things through.
You just want to get everybody in a room together and go, right, come on, folks.
What are we doing? And a lot of the time, a lot of the things are addressed just through that ability to communicate directly. The issue is that the processes are such, it's very difficult to get that front-face communication.
So the advantage of getting planning is you can make a lot of money. And some of our sites, we've secured a site and then we've got planning permission and we've tripled the value of the site and we haven't lifted a shovel. So it's a really good feeling when that happens. But at the same time, it can be a very long process. If someone's wanting to, maybe carry out some extensions or build some houses and they need a team, at what point would you recommend bringing on a planning consultant over an architect that says, I can give you some basic, I can liaise with the council? When would you say, no, I need a planning consultant?
So the easiest way of determining that, and I'm not one for parachuting ourselves in when we're not needed. In a lot of the smaller cases, the architect, especially if they know the area, they can address things. Planning consultants are there to address things where they're more complex or simply where it's just difficult to get things through in one particular location, right? The easiest way to know whether you need it or not, ultimately, is to do a little bit of due diligence yourself. So understand what you think the risks are of a planning application. Try to be objective with that. And then when you speak to an architect, you feel that they're maybe underplaying things or being a bit casual about it, then I think at that point you say, okay, well, perhaps we just need to test the waters in terms of cost risk. Look, in most cases, I would say it doesn't take much to contact the planning consultants and just ask them for a little bit of broad brush advice to start with. Most of them will provide that relatively quickly. You can then get a flavour from them whether you think this site's more risky than we originally thought. And if it is, then you can make that decision in conjunction with your architect. Okay, do we need that additional support? But we've all got our functions, right? I can't draw, but I know pretty much every single planning policy, piece of planning law in England and Wales. Yeah. An architect, they can often get applications through, but it's off the back of the quality of their designs rather than understanding how to play the policies off against each other. Yeah. So I would say most circumstances, you definitely need an architect. You don't definitely need a planning consultant. But if you feel that the case is going to be more tricky than perhaps everyone expects, then that's when to call us. That's great. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on, and you've been an absolute fountain of knowledge. So I appreciate your time coming out. Pleasure. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into planning and how to get planning permission. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit it a like, subscribe, and we will see you guys next time.